Hey everyone, it's Aila from The Last Stitch. Do you want to get better at sewing with knits but a bit unsure where to start? Well, in today's video I will give you the complete beginner's guide to sewing with knits. If you want to start working with knits, one of the first things you might ask yourself is, can I sew with knits using just a regular sewing machine, or do I need an overlock machine and perhaps even a cover stitch machine to hem the knits? Well, there are different answers to that. It all depends on your needs and your wallet, basically your budget, and of course what type of finish you're looking for. So I'm going to start now with the pros and cons of using a sewing machine for sewing with knits. Well, the pros of a sewing machine is that most sewing machines, even my vintage one, which is from the 80s, and I actually had sewing machines from the 70s, that also actually are configured to sew certain stretch stitches. And when I say stretch stitches, they are basically overlock stitches that has fantastic stretchability, and they don't pop when you stretch out the fabric, so they're also really durable, and they look actually quite similar to an overlock stitch that's done on a serger. So that's one of the good things about using a sewing machine, is that you can actually sew with knits on it. Actually have stitches that will work for your the needs when you're sewing with knits. The biggest drawback of using a sewing machine is that it doesn't feed the fabric in a way that is really beneficial when you're working with stretchy knits, such as four-way stitch, lycra, spandex knits, all those stretchy knits that is so popular these days. And also if you're doing with very soft, supple knits that doesn't have a lot of shape, what can happen when you're using a sewing machine is that you'll end up with wobbly, stretched out seams. And this is a reality, and it's not you. It's just that the sewing machine is optimized for working with woven fabrics. So if you are wanting to use a sewing machine for those type of fabrics, you definitely need to apply some tricks, basically. And a few of those is one that is called Sew Thought, which is basically, I probably pronounced this wrong, but it's basically mean that you keep, when you're sewing the fabric, you keep it quite firmly and try to make sure that it doesn't stretch out. So you're basically like manipulating the fabric using your hands. This is a technique that needs a little bit of practice, but it's definitely very effective. Another way of controlling the stretch is to use an awl. Gently pushes the upper layer of the fabric, because that's usually, you will have a discrepancy when you're working on a regular sewing machine, that will uneven feeding of the layer of fabrics. You just gently push the fabric towards the presser for the upper layer, and this will also make sure that the feeding is even. Some people also like to use a walking foot, because then again this makes sure it provides more even feeding. The drawback, I think, with using a walking foot is that not all walking foots will do great with the sort of stretch stitches, but if you're just sewing like a regular not too wide zigzag stitch, it will definitely work. But of course you should not, if you're working with stretch knits, don't ever use a straight stitch, right? Because that will pop. So those are the things you can consider for sure. It comes with practice, as I said, but you can definitely achieve quite good results just using a regular sewing machine. The step up is, of course, is investing in an overlocker. Now, an overlocker, the biggest advantage of that, basically two things, is the first one is that it provides the overlock seam, which forms loops and provides a fantastically durable and extremely elastic stitch with fantastic recovery. And also an overlock machine or a serger has adjustment for differential feed, which you can actually adjust how the fabric is feeded when you're sewing, which means that you can actually keep it taut. It won't stretch out. You can just manipulate or adjust the knob, just do that on the serger. It will also look really professional, because when you look inside a ready-to-wear knit garment, they're all done using a serger. So if that's your thing, you really want to get the professional look, then of course you should perhaps consider investing in a serger. Another thing that it makes it so great for knits is that it's so fast, because when you're using a regular sewing machine and doing stretch stitch, the needle will move back and forth, back and forth, back and forth to create that overlock seam. So it takes quite a long time, and it's a nightmare to rip. I forgot to say that. Whereas an overlock, it's just boom, and you're done. That's basically how fast it is. Maybe I was exaggerating a little bit, but not much. So yeah, that's one of the other benefits of also having a serger when you're sewing with it. And if not 2 machines were not enough to break the bank, then there's also the third machine, which is a Coverstitch machine, which I have done several videos about and also written a book about, Master the Coverstitch Machine. And some people ask me if a Coverstitch machine and the serger are the same thing. No, they're not. In simple terms, you could say that a serger is the thing that you use to sew the side seams on a garment, and the Coverstitch machine is what you use for finishing, for instance, stitching down the binding, hemming, all that stuff. That is usually done on a Coverstitch machine. So if you want to get like a professional t-shirt finish, for instance, they are in the garment industry, they're using both a serger and a Coverstitch machine. Now, of course, there are also some machines that are called combination machines that are actually doing both things with a little bit of changes when you have to change the setup. If you're curious about that, you can definitely check out the playlist I've done about Coverstitch machine, and also in particular one that is called A Buyer's Guide to Coverstitch Machine, to just give you more explanation of what type of different machines are available and if that's something you should invest in. Because when you're starting to add 3 machines into the mix, then you know that can break anyone's budget, because good sewing machines are not cheap. So perhaps looking into used good quality machines could be an option. But that's definitely something to consider when you're sewing with knits, is how much do you want to invest in this. And I think it should be also based on how much knit garments you're making. Just doing one occasional top once a year, I can't really see that you need to invest in a serger. But I should also say that a serger is also used for finishing the overcasting the edges of woven and lots of other things, like doing roll hem, and well, it's doing a lot of different things. So it's definitely not just for knits. I use my serger for tons of other stuff as well. Now, the biggest struggle, I think, if you're using a regular sewing machine when you're sewing with knits, is the hemming bits, because that's usually where a lot of the stretched out wobbly things can happen, and also because a lot of pop seams, because when you're stitching across, because you know stretch has always the greatest degree this way, greatest degree of stretch this way, which means that this is an area that could easily pop if the seam is not durable enough. So if you are just doing it on a regular sewing machine, you should definitely check out my video on how to hem stitch knits using a regular sewing machine. That's a really good video, it goes through all the different options. But in short, you have a couple of different things you can do. One of the most common one is to use a twin needle. You should definitely use a ballpoint needle. It's made for stretch fabrics. And the twin needle sews 2 straight stitches on the upper layer, and then it sews a zigzag stitch below. So that's definitely something that is a good starter method if you want to hem knits and you just have a sewing machine. Another thing you can do is also to use like a regular zigzag stitch. You can also use some of the type of decorative stitches that I think most sewing machines has, because they usually also have a lot of stretch because they have stitched so many tiny stitches. Another option, which I'm super fond of myself, is to use the blind hem presser foot and actually do a blind hem stitch. And again, I've done a video where I show that method, so link will be in the description section, and of course in the playlist that I've compiled for this video, so you can learn more about this method. But it's really good if you're sewing with knits, and this actually works for quite stretchy knits as well. The only thing it doesn't work with, if you're doing like working with like thin stretch knits, it doesn't really work. But if you're working with sweater knits, if you're working with sweatshirt fabrics, if you're working with like a bit more thicker rib knits, they will all do really nicely with a blind hem foot. Now, needles are also super important when you're sewing with knits. One thing you will definitely encounter, regardless if you're using a regular sewing machine or a Coverstitch machine, you will end up having skipped stitches if you're not using the proper method. And the biggest thing probably is to get the right type of needles. They need to have a ballpoint shape that is specifically done for sewing with stretchy knits. I'm holding in my hand now the stretch needle for Schmetz. Organ also has the similar needles, so they are called super stretch. There are also jersey needles from Schmetz. They are more designed for like non-stretchy knit fabrics, such as very firmer cotton jersey, for instance. And again, if you're using a twin needle, definitely buy the one that is designed for stretch fabric, because that will prevent skip stitches and piercing holes. And it usually you use around size 75 or 80 is probably the most common ones for knits. It all depends a little bit on the fabric as well. but usually around that ballpark is a good size for most knits. Another thing you need to know when you're sewing tops, for instance, in knits, is that you need to stabilize certain areas. The most key part is the shoulder seam, because stretchy fabrics combined with the fact that you're also sewing it slightly slanted, which means that you will have huge amount of stretch if you don't stabilize it. And you can use different methods. I describe all of these in my video on how to stabilize shoulder seams. But in short, you can use a fusible, you can use a strip of fabric, you can use clear elastic. Any of these methods works really well on stabilizing the shoulder seam. And there are also other ways of stabilizing the seam when you're sewing when it's one that I really like is this. It's called Wonder Tape. It's actually water-soluble, double-sided tape that you just press between 2 layers of fabric, stitch, and then when you wash the fabric, it dissolves. So no trace of it. And this is so useful when you're sewing with knits, because regardless of what type of machine you're using, you will often have problems with not being able to fully control the knit fabric, because it's such a, loose, crazy type of fabric to work with, especially if you're not used to it. So definitely invest in Wonder Tape. I'll definitely also link to that product. It's really, really good. And another thing that I also can recommend is to use some type of stabilizer. Some like to use water-soluble stabilizer. You can also use some type of fusible interfacing that is designed for knits. I've actually done a blog post about that as well. You can check out in the description section on different types. But it's really good to have when you are struggling. For instance, if you're sewing like a collar, sometimes if you have problems with a hem, then a lightweight fusible stabilizer is made especially for knits, will actually solve a lot of those problems. So definitely worth investing in as well. As I said, you can definitely be really successful sewing knits using your home sewing equipment. And yeah, you can even get far with a regular sewing machine. And if I would give you one recommendation, is to start with the easier knit fabrics. And when I say easier knit fabrics, I mean sweatshirt fabrics, stable sweater knits, piqué fabrics, for instance, and 100% cotton jersey or any other type of jersey that doesn't have a ton of stretch. Start with those, see if you like it. French terry is also great fabric, and then you can move on to the more tricky ones. When I say tricky ones, I am talking about lycra fabric, I am talking about rib knits, and some of those rather shapeless soft fabrics. It is wonderful to feel and touch with your hands, but can be a bit more difficult to sew. And when you move into that phase, that's when you need to start to think about if you can be just fine with a regular sewing machine or if it's worth investing in a serger. Because those easier fabric I mentioned first, you can definitely work really well just using a regular sewing machine. So I hope you find this video really useful. As I said, I've done lots of other videos about sewing with knits, link to those below. And I wish you all the best when it comes to sewing with knits. It's personally one of my favorite things to sew. So I'm really, really curious to hear how your projects are going. Stitch safe, and I'll see you next time.